When I joined RCIA as a newly minted young adult, I was almost immediately recruited as the electric guitarist for the youth band at the youth ministry at what eventually would become my parish. And when I was a part of this band, it felt like we were really pushing the envelope of liturgical acceptability by playing songs that were as contemporary to our sensibilities as you could get on, let's say, Christian radio. In other words, we were playing the latest and the greatest of Christian praise and worship. But as we did so, we would often get approached by people after Mass who would come up and talk to us and say, can't you choose some more traditional songs? You know, songs like One Bread, One Body, or Sing a New Song. So to satisfy those kinds of concerns, as part of our process for picking songs, we would always make sure that we would pick some, like a quota from a hymnal like Breaking Bread to satisfy the more traditional crowd. Ironically, and little did I know as an uninformed RCIA candidate, those songs aren't traditional at all. They were written as part of a wave of liturgical revolution in the late 20th century, but because currents of fashion move at a pace that the church can't possibly hope to keep up with, they had now become old-fashioned and taken on the aroma of irrelevancy and, in the eyes of some like us, tradition. What I didn't understand was that the Catholics from my parents' and my grandparents' generations did something unprecedented in the history of the Catholic Church. When their ancestors tried to transmit the traditional Catholic faith and culture to them, which had been handed to them through their ancestors diligently and with great care and reverence, my parents' generation said, no thanks. We're going to do things our own way here on out. We're going to reinvent Catholic culture according to the influence of the popular contemporary culture of our generation, which we are so enamored with. And if that's a legitimate process of cultural succession, to reject your ancestors' culture in preference for a process of perpetually reinventing the culture according to the preferences of your generation in a particular given moment in time, then the thing that the Catholics from my parents' generation need to realize is that their liturgical and cultural sensibilities are just as susceptible to that process as their parents' generation. In other words, and I say this with a sense of regret, not triumphalism in any respect, but what goes around comes around. What I found in those early days of my faith when I was part of a band trying to push the liturgical envelope was that we weren't going to be given the same liberty from my parents' generation that they themselves had seized upon. If we, and especially older generations, want young people to participate in the life of the church, and apparently this is a problem, this is a complaint, this is something that I have read a lot about in the reports from the whole synod on synodality process, that there are a lack of young people in the church, and where are the young people, and what can we do to bring them back to the church? If that's something that is a true desire from among older generations, then older generations like baby boomers are going to have to suppress, they're going to have to learn to suppress their own cultural preferences in deference to those preferences of successive generations like millennials, in the same way that they expected their parents and their grandparents' generations to embrace and accept their own cultural revolution. And if there's an unwillingness to do that, and I can totally understand why there would be, then maybe we need to admit that that isn't a legitimate way for culture to progress from one generation to another. Maybe it's a bad idea to treat your parents' and your grandparents' culture with contempt in the hopes that you can seize the reins and make the culture all about your current generation. This kind of cultural incoherence is a big part of the reason why I think that there's a lack of young Catholics in the church today. And let's be honest about that. There is a lack of young people in the church today, because they're being told that they can't have a Catholic culture that reflects the contemporary sensibilities of their own generation, the cultural sensibilities, like their parents' generation were allowed to do. But at the same time, they're not allowed to embrace a tradition that is truly tradition. Catholics like myself find ourselves being suppressed and even scapegoated for embracing traditionalism. Instead, they have to embrace an anti-tradition tradition that was developed in the 1960s and treat it with the kind of reverence and enthusiasm that people of that time were unwilling to treat previous traditions with. To help explain what this is like for young Catholics, I want to try to use an analogy. So imagine you've died and now you're being processed and initiated into the kingdom of heaven. And at one juncture in the process, they say, okay, now it's time for you to pick out your outfit, your uniform. And this is going to be something that you're going to have to wear for the rest of your life. So remember, this is something that is going to have eternal consequence. And there are two options available, each with their own advocate to try to sell you on the two options. The first person says, hey, check this one out. This was designed in the 1970s or the 1960s by the greatest cutting edge fashion designers. We had our best people working on it. And this is probably the closest you're going to get to the time that you lived in. So it's really relevant and cool. Then the other person brings out a uniform that's very plain looking and they say, this is a very functional garment that has inspiration from the ancient world and was developed through the centuries to be timeless and modest. It isn't very cool, but it will get the job done. The first thing I would think is that if among my highest priorities whenever I'm making decisions is about choosing something that is current and fashionable and contemporary and cool, well, neither of these options are the right one for me. They both come to me from an era and a time that is not my own. They are both traditions to me. And if I have to pick a tradition, then I'm going to pick the best tradition. If I have to make a choice that comes to me from two different traditions that is going to have eternal consequences for me, then I'm going to choose the one that is most eternally significant, the one that is most relatable and relevant to the many, many generations that came before me, rather than the one that is only relevant to a narrow sliver of time. Similarly today, when young Catholics are presented with options of how they can express their Catholic faith through cultural incarnations, they see that they can sing songs and say prayers and practice a liturgy that was designed in the 1960s and 70s by our best people with a view of making it more culturally relevant to that generation. Or you can try to rediscover the ancient, timeless expressions of the Catholic faith, the one that the most number of Catholics who are part of the communion of saints will recognize as their own, and which was designed to be timeless and eternally relevant. Well, most young Catholics would look at these two options and say neither are relevant to the contemporary sensibilities of my generation. They are both traditions to me, so I'm going to find more appeal in the one that is simply the better tradition. When I think about the kind of songs that I want to sing to lift my heart and mind to God, do I want to sing a song like Gather Us In, written by Protestant composer Marty Haugen in like 1980? Or do I want to sing a hymn with an ancient and timeless pedigree, like Let All Mortal Flesh Keep Silence, or something like Adorote Devote, written by St. Thomas Aquinas? When I imagine the hosts of angels and saints singing God's praise in union with ours as they participate in the liturgy here on earth, do I imagine them singing something with a timeless and eternal significance? Or do I imagine them saying, oh, not this one again. Can we get something a little more fun and new? Maybe something with tamarines, or let's get this needs more cowbell.
I gotta have more cowbell.
If our only options are a tradition and another tradition, then let's pick the one that is the better tradition, and we might get some indication of that by the one that is intentionally traditional, rather than the one that is only accidentally traditional because it grew old whilst trying to stay young. If you want to know where the young Catholics are, they're either trying to reinvent the cultural wheel and being maligned for it like I was as part of that youth band, or they're looking at the two traditions, one from the 1960s and one from the entire pedigree of the entire church that came before the 1960s, and saying, I suspect the latter has more substance to it. My family goes to the Latin Mass not because we're stuck in time or excessively nostalgic, but because the liturgy codified in the 1560s with a view to honor the faith of the 1460s and the 1360s and the 1260s and all the way down through the centuries is a better tradition than the one developed in the 1960s to honor the culture of the 1960s and to reject all previous centuries as inferior to the present day. And in my experience, the proof is in the pudding. The average age at the Latin Mass that I go to, if you just count the adults, is probably around my age. If you include the children in that, it's probably closer to like 16 or maybe even younger than that. By contrast, the average age at the parish I used to go to, and I'm still a registered member of, is probably pushing 60. Nobody will ever be drawn to the Catholic Church because of its contemporary relevance, even if we try to make it as relevant to the contemporary sensibilities as possible. Pop culture, secularism, and relativism will always be far more relevant to the contemporary mood of the world around us. That's not an arena we can compete in, and to try to do so is to become a contradiction. People who are drawn to the Catholic Church are so because they recognize something foundational and something reliable in tradition, where the promises of relativism and the world around them have failed them. We have to admit that the church is in cultural and demographic freefall, and the only thing that can save it and renew it is a culture built on the rock of tradition, not a culture that has come and gone like the sand that it was built on. Hey, thanks for watching. The reason I can continue making content like this is because of the generous support of my viewers. If you are able to support the work I'm doing, there are a couple of ways you can do that: by donating through my website or by joining my online community, The Reinforcements. Both can be done by visiting brianholdsworth.ca, the .ca because that's how we intranet in Canada. Members will have the opportunity to personally interact with myself and other community members, and certain levels will receive a free gift basket from Glory and Shine, who is a family-owned Catholic bath and body products company whose beard balm I'm wearing right now. Members also get free access to Christ-Centered Capital, which offers ethical investing tips that are in accord with Catholic beliefs. Even if you aren't able to support my work, consider checking both of them out at gloryandshine.com and christcenteredcapital.com. And of course, don't forget to like and subscribe. And again, thanks for watching.